recommendations. I'm going to do my best to keep myself awake after lunch. This is going to be tough. But what I'll talk about today is specific to Dairy Nutrient Management Act, dairies in particular, but also broadly, any crop farmer or livestock facility that uses and manages manure, there is overlap in the regulations, and I'll try to make sure that I point that out as I go through. So let's begin at the beginning with actually the Clean Water Act. That is a federal regulation that applies to everybody in the United States. EPA has the authority to delegate the implementation of the federal Clean Water Act to states, which they did to the Washington State Department of Ecology back in the 70s, I believe. And Ecology wrote the Water Pollution Control Act to implement the federal act. So the state act implements the federal act. For the most part, it addresses surface water. And it is this Water Pollution Control Act that applies to everyone in Washington state. So livestock, residential, commercial, if you have the potential to impact surface water or pollute surface water, this is the act that applies to you. Now in 1998, Ecology, along with other stakeholders, wrote the Dairy Nutrient Management Act in an effort to get a better handle on agricultural sources of pollution. So that Dairy Nutrient Management Act, written in 1998, and that's in fact when the Dairy Nutrient Management Program started with the Department of Ecology. In 2003, Ecology, through a memorandum of understanding, now the Department of Agriculture, us, we have authority to implement the Dairy Nutrient Management Act. And for the most part, this is the area that I'm going to focus on, just the Dairy Nutrient Management Act, dairies, nutrient management planning, that kind of good information. But definitely there's overlap. So the Nutrient Management Act, RCW 9064, has very specific requirements for dairies. The requirements are to register. The minute a dairy starts shipping milk, they have to send the Department of Agriculture's Dairy Nutrient Management Program, there's a lot of words in there, a registration. It tells us who you are, where you are, how many cows you have, whether you're thinking about composting, whether you're exporting manure, all that kind of good stuff. A registration within 60 days of getting your milk license. Within 6 months of getting your milk license, we want to see a dairy nutrient management plan that has been approved by the Conservation District. Now the overlap between dairies and non-dairy, anybody can get a nutrient management plan. And if you are managing manure, you should have a nutrient management plan, possibly written by your Conservation District. If you're a dairy, there are very specific elements in that plan that must be addressed and must be approved by the Conservation District Board. Within 18 months after approval, so 2 years after your license, we're kind of going forward here, you have to have that plan certified by the Conservation District Board. That tells me that the elements of your plan are actually being implemented. So all of those things that have been identified as needing to be addressed to be protective of waters of the state, to manage your nutrients, to balance the nitrates on your farm, all of those things have been addressed. So approval, certification, 2 years. The Dairy Nutrient Management Act also requires, and this came about in 2009, so relatively recent, also requires dairies to maintain 5 years worth of records. And those records are specified in a rule that was written in 2012. So again, pretty recent information, but since 2009, dairies have been required to keep very specific records. And no surprise, dairies are also required to prevent discharges. That goes for everybody. If you're managing a manure, if you're a livestock facility, you must prevent discharges to waters of the state. Sediment, nutrients, bacterial pollution discharges. So the Nutrient Management Act also requires very specific things of the Dairy Nutrient Management Program, one of which is to conduct inspections. It's a policy within our program that we conduct inspections every 18 to 22 months on dairies. Whether you have 1 cow or 10,000 cows, we are out there on your facility routinely every 18 to 22 months. That's our policy. And with that inspection comes regulatory technical assistance. So when we come onto your facility, we're looking around and we're saying, okay, here's maybe a problem spot. we would like to refer you, we'll either have a recommendation on how to fix that to be protective of waters of the state, or we're going to refer you back to your conservation district for some extra technical assistance. Conservation districts, non-regulatory. Department of Agriculture Dairy Nutrient Management Program, regulatory. So there's definitely a difference. We are also required to monitor the development of your nutrient management plan. What this means is we're looking for those deadlines. 6 months after your license, do you have an approved plan? 18 months later, has your plan been certified? We're required to keep a database. The database, and some of you who I've inspected have watched me struggle with our database in the past. It's a work in progress, but what it does is it captures the interactions that we have, whether it's a routine inspection or a follow-up inspection or an investigation. It captures that interaction between Department of Agriculture and the dairy. We also maintain a penalty grant account. As it says, the account is filled up with penalties that we collect from civil penalties assessed on dairies. Now, penalties are a bummer. The penalty grant account is pretty cool because unlike some other agencies that collect penalties, the penalties from this program do not go back out into the general fund. They stay within our program and they help fund education and research. So right now we have some kind of cool research projects going on in the wings. 2 of them with WSU, 2 different projects with WSU, one looking at lagoon leakage monitoring, and one looking at massive vermicomposting beds to process lagoon water. So a couple different research projects. All of this money for the penalty grant account goes back out for education and research to dairies. So that's kind of a cool thing. All right, inspections. A little bit about inspections. We have 5 inspectors in Washington State. We have about 400 dairies. Everybody has a little bit of a different style, but if we're coming onto your dairy, here's what you can expect. We're going to look at the condition of your facility. What kind of shape is it in? Are you managing to contain and collect and then direct your manure to the appropriate storage? Some of the little dairies maybe don't even have a lagoon. How is that manure being captured and protecting waterways if you're not containing it in a lagoon? If you do have a lagoon, we should be able to get out there and tromp all the way around the top of that lagoon. We're looking at lagoon integrity. So when we look at the lagoon, we want to be able to obviously see it. It needs to be mowed, maintained. So lagoon condition. If we see issues, we're going to refer you back to your conservation district or your technical service provider to have those issues addressed. Fields and filter strips. Another thing about capturing, containing, maintaining the integrity of those fields and filter strips is where are you applying the manure? Are you using appropriate buffers? If you're using a filter strip to manage some facility runoff, is that filter strip healthy? Again, if we see issues, we're probably going to refer you back to your conservation district for technical assistance with developing, maybe reinvigorating the health of that filter strip. And then record keeping. Sometimes record keeping is the piece that takes me the longest when I'm on your facility. Those 5 years worth of records and all of those different required records, I'm going to be digging through all of them because that's the piece that gives me a look at what's happening underneath your soil. I can look at the facility and see that nothing's running off, but what are you doing as far as managing the nutrients on your facility? So record keeping I'll talk more about in the next presentation, but just know that record keeping is an important part of every facility operation, dairy or non-dairy crop farmer. Records are important. And you'll hear me talk a little bit about, so there's overlap in what I talked about and what Joe Harrison talked about from WSU. You'll hear some of the same things, so that's probably a good thing. Investigations. We do investigations. I mentioned that we are a regulatory agency. We sure are. If there is a suspicion of a discharge or we get a complaint phoned in, we're obligated to follow up on that complaint. We have a little bit of discretion, and it's actually written into law. If it's the same complainant at the same facility for the same issue time and time again, and we've been out there 11 times and we don't find an issue, we can usually respond to that complaint with a phone call to the producer and say, oh, okay, I understand what's going on. Sometimes we have excessive complaints for some issues. But when we follow up on a complaint and we do an investigation, this right here should be number one. We work with the producers. If we can't meet with the producer and find out what's going on, we have no hope of identifying what the real issue is and then resolving that issue. So we work with the producers. We will review your records. Maybe the complaint is about field runoff. Well, we're going to look at your application records. When did you apply last? How much did you apply? Where did you apply it? We look at those records. We may pull water samples. So that's what's happening right here. Curry is pulling a sample, and it's going to be tested for fecal coliform bacteria. That's an example of what fecal coliform bacteria looks like growing on a sample plate. There is a state water quality standard for fecal coliform bacteria, and it varies depending on which waterway you're potentially impacting. Somewhere between 100 parts, 100 fecal coliform units per wait a minute, let me re-say that. 100 coliform forming units per 100 milliliters to 200, so it varies. Then the field inspectors, of which Nicole mentioned I am one of them, we have to write up a recommendation for enforcement if we think that there is indeed an issue. And that RFE is the story of what happened. We're looking at records, we're looking at samples, we're looking at photos. It's the story of what happened to say, yes, there was a violation, or no, there wasn't a violation. And that recommendation for enforcement comes to the Olympia office, and I'm also the compliance specialist, so I review all those recommendations. And then in Olympia, we determine whether it is informal enforcement or formal enforcement. We have a very specific compliance path that we follow. We always start with regulatory technical assistance. And that's what you'll get from us when we're out there just doing a regular inspection. If an issue is not addressed, we move on to a warning letter. It's a letter from your inspector that says, well, last time we were out there and we talked to you about this, we still think that this is a potential problem. This has the potential to pollute and it needs to be addressed. If we go out again, oh, and there usually should be a follow-up date associated with that warning letter. If we go out again and that issue is still not addressed, you're probably going to get a notice of correction. And that's where the inspector has to write up that recommendation for enforcement. It is still considered informal enforcement, but it goes through extensive review, and there's an extensive amount of paperwork behind that notice of correction. If the issue is still not addressed and we do identify a violation, whether it's lack of records or there's a discharge, those are the two types of violations, then you'll get a notice of penalty. Now, the crossover between the Department of Agriculture and the State Department of Ecology with the non-dairy folks, they have to follow this same process. If they identify an issue in a non-dairy livestock facility, they also are obliged to start with regulatory technical assistance. And then they have an informal enforcement process, and then they have a formal enforcement process. So those two things are pretty darn similar. Now, nobody wants to get to a notice of a penalty. And in fact, really relatively few do. If we add up all of the informal enforcement, starting with notice of correction and up, informal enforcement, 97% of issues identified are usually addressed in that informal enforcement phase. So that's good news. We don't have very many folks going to notice a penalty. I forgot to mention immediate action order. That's something that we can put out in almost a day. We still have to work through a process internally, but we can get that out in a day. And that usually means, holy smokes, there's something really, really wrong and you need to stop it right now. The notice of penalty takes a considerable amount of time to get done. Again, the notice of penalty, there's it's a civil penalty. There is a dollar amount associated with the penalty. And the good thing, if there is a good thing in there, is that when a facility is assessed a penalty, we want them to come back to the Department of Agriculture and say, how about if we settle, and if I pay half of this penalty or less of this penalty, in exchange, I will do this. It's almost like an incentive program, a little backwards. It's more of the stick instead of the carrot, but it's almost like an incentive program because it gives the facility an opportunity to say, here's what I can do if you don't fine me this much money. There's still going to be some monetary fine associated with the civil penalty. So I want to talk a little bit about incentives now that I've talked about penalties. In 2015, the legislative session went forever and ever and ever and ever. It finally ended in, I think, July in 2015. And when it ended, Department of Agriculture was given a gift of $575,000. It was a proviso. It's called a proviso budget amendment. And that $575,000 that came into the Department of Agriculture's Dairy Nutrient Management Program is going back out into the community, both dairies and non-dairy, to do education. So I talked about the stick, that civil penalty and the law. This is the carrot. What we're hoping to do with all of these resources is give people the tools that maybe they don't have or they forgot they knew or can now find out where to find them, to reduce the amount of discharges, to increase the level of record keeping, to give them the tools to not go down that compliance path. So we are hoping that this 2-year proviso project, part of which funded this meeting here today, will be the incentive to get producers to reduce the impact on water quality, thereby not needing any more rules and regulations. Because the alternative, if water quality isn't improved, is more rules and regulations. So we want carrots, we don't like sticks. So the proviso is a carrot. Nicole asked me to talk about kind of what's happening out there. And this relates specifically to dairies, but at some point it could relate to non-dairy livestock owners. In October 2015, CAFO means Confined Animal Feeding Operation. Department of Ecology released a preliminary draft CAFO permit. And they did the right thing by saying this is preliminary draft. It gave them a really long time to receive comments, and wow, did they receive comments. Almost 5,000 pages of comments were received. The draft permit is based on discharges to waters of the state. So within Washington State, I think we still have about 10 facilities left with a CAFO permit, and that means there has been a discharge to waters of the state. If you have a discharge, then you are obliged to have a CAFO permit. That's the rule. Ecology is rewriting that CAFO permit, and in this current iteration, it's saying if you have a lagoon, then you have a discharge and you need a permit. So of the 400 dairies in Washington State, probably 375 of them would automatically be required to get the CAFO permit, because they're saying if you have a lagoon, then you have a discharge, and if you have a discharge, then you need a CAFO permit. All of the comments received since the preliminary draft went out, it is changing the way that Department of Ecology is looking at the language in that draft permit. I don't know what that's going to look like. I heard some scuttlebutt yesterday that the draft permit might be out in March of this year. And again, that opens up another window of comment. It's not the final be-all of permits, but that's kind of what's on the horizon for dairies. And again, for crossover, anybody who confines animals in a space for 45 days or more where that space does not grow crops, they're technically a confined animal feeding operation. So CAFO permits can apply to pretty much everybody. Generally, they don't apply to small facilities. If you have less than 200 animals, generally you don't have a CAFO permit unless you've really sinned. So kind of keep that in mind. You're probably not going to be under the CAFO regulations if you have a small farm. Let's see here. Oh, this is kind of a cool picture. This is actually the inside of a manure storage tank. Obviously before it's been filled with manure, but there are some of the things that facilities are looking at that are alternatives to storing manure, alternatives other than lagoons, in the ground lagoons. And the thought is that if you have an upright storage tank, you don't have a lagoon, therefore it doesn't leak, therefore you would not be eligible for that CAFO permit or required to get it. So that's one of the things. Last slide. The Dairy Nutrient Management Program has very specific missions. We are to protect water quality from animal nutrient discharges, and we are to help maintain a healthy agricultural business climate. That's our mission. So part of everything we do is an effort to make sure that not only are you being supported in your agricultural business, and you're being protective of waters of the state. Sometimes it's a pretty fine line that we walk, and we absolutely depend on all of our partners to help make sure that you get to both places. One of the things that we're doing to make sure that you get there is participating in events like this. You know, clear guidance, education, technical assistance, equitable enforcement of the rules and regulations for all dairies, and certainly good communication. We work very hard to be communicative with our producers. We want them to call us, and we want to have an open dialogue with our producers and with all of the other stakeholders that are involved in regulating water quality. That's it for rules and regulations. Was that too painful? Not too bad. So go ahead. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and ask them now.
You said that you were granted $575,000 through the state. Is that correct?
The state provided that to the Department of Agriculture's Dairy Nutrient Management Program. Okay, so it's not a grant, but then we put that money back out.
All right. And then you said there's only $95,000 of that's going out in grants.
This year.
This year.
So far this year, we've had $95,000 go back out in grants to conservation districts.
And what happens to the other $480,000?
Some of that money is going to go back out in the next year for more education grants, and some of it paid for the 1.5 FTEs that you see up here. Let's get back there. We have 1.5 temporary employees, full-time equivalent employees, for the next 2 years that will be paid for through this grant to do additional outreach to producers.
So the Department of Ag handles just dairies. So if you are, say, a beef producer or a crop producer, you'd be under Department of Ecology's jurisdiction for water quality impacts, correct?
Correct. So
you have a similar process?
They don't have an inspection process or a record-keeping requirement, but if there's an issue identified, then they have a similar follow-up process that requires technical assistance, informal enforcement, and then formal enforcement. So they're not under the same scrutiny that dairies are.